Hello, everybody. Thank you for listening to the Healthy Project podcast. I'm your host, Corey Dion Lewis. And today I have Sarah Vogel with me. She is the Senior Vice President for Healthy Communities at the Environmental Defense Fund. And we are about to get into a conversation that I think is very valuable, and not only for those that are in public health spaces, but just people in general, anybody. We're talking about the chemicals in your everyday products, your home, your kid stuff, and the federal law that's supposed to protect you from them. It's been 10 years since the law got a major overhaul, and right now there are people trying to change it. Sarah has been in this fight for a very long time, and I'm glad she is here to walk us through it. So, Sarah, welcome to the Healthy Project podcast.
Thank you for having me, Corey.
Yes. So, you have a PhD from Columbia, degrees from Yale in public health and environmental management. No stranger to this work, and been doing this for a very long time. What pulled you towards this work specifically? And was there a moment or experience that made it personal for you?
Yeah, so I've been in it a long time. You're making me feel really old, but I am. It's been a long time, and it's kind of amazing that we're at a milestone now. But, um, you know, really going back to when I was a kid, I was just drawn to nature. That's where I found that was my happy place. I loved being outdoors. I loved trees. I loved hiking. I got to spend some of my childhood on the Front Range out in Colorado, and it was just magnificent. And so I had this affiliation or affinity to the natural world, and then there was this other part of me that was quite kind of political, if you will. And I think early on, when I would see the destruction of natural spaces, I would get very impassioned and tried to protect like a tree from being torn down in our neighborhood with the neighborhood kids when I was really little. And then in my early 20s, so I studied environmental policy in college, but then in my early 20s, I got introduced to this emerging field of science that was looking at how the chemicals that are used in all around us in plastics and furniture and carpeting and personal care products, how they were interacting with our bodies and having impacts on our health. And it really blew my mind in many ways, because it was really how the environment literally would impact our health. And I got just enthralled by that. And that's where a lot of the work I did with those degrees came around. But I was really interested in this question of why? Why have we allowed that to happen? How is it these chemicals have come into our bodies and into our world? You know, the important things that they've done, but how is it that we haven't fully tackled this issue of what they're doing to our health? And I ended up writing a whole book about it, where I looked at one chemical in particular that some people may have heard about before, called bisphenol A, or BPA. Mm-hmm. And it was right when a lot of folks were very concerned that it was in the plastics used primarily in baby bottles. And it was what's called an endocrine disruptor. And so I talked about kind of how this chemical came to be and the battles over how it has changed our lives and literally our bodies. So that's the short version of my journey to this space.
No, I love it. And you said something, is interesting about, all what it makes me think, and correct me if I'm wrong. There's only so much as a consumer that I know that goes into something, but you have, this team that is leading this pathway, these, attorneys and scientists and all these experts. What does it on the back end? What does protecting health from toxic chemicals actually look like on a day-to-day? Like the things that me that just goes and grabs it from the store has no idea, like what it takes.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of work trying to change this problem, this system. And my organization and many others have been working for a long time on this. When it comes to the Environmental Defense Fund, or EDF, where I'm at, I think we take a lot of pride in the fact that we are being public servants, right? We are working to protect these public goods, right? The water that you drink, the air that you breathe, the products you bring into your home, because we firmly believe that you shouldn't, you as an individual have enough to worry about, that you shouldn't actually have to have a PhD or a degree in toxicology, or be able to decipher all what this all means. You shouldn't have to do that in order to turn on the tap or go buy a product, right? And so a lot of the work that we do is focused on how do we solve this problem. One of the reasons I've stayed at EDF and I've loved working here is that we're committed to finding solutions, not just talking about the problem, but how do we build solutions. And when you kind of come at the issue that way, it means you have to bring a lot of different people together. It means you have to talk to different people who may be far outside your sort of domain of interest or whatever. So we'll often bring folks in the private sector together with community-based organizations, with different governments. Like, how do we all come together? Public health officials, nurses, doctors. How can we collectively build enough momentum to solve for some of these big problems? So, for example, years ago when I first came to EDF, we worked with the retailer Walmart, that really behind the scenes, to help them develop what was a voluntary policy to address chemicals of concern in their supply chain. That's a huge retailer having enormous impact, and it really became an industry standard. And then when it comes to the rules that the government will be issuing around different chemicals and guidance, this is the stuff that's really behind the scenes, right? We and many others are evaluating those for their scientific integrity. Are they following the laws we intended? Are they protecting the public? And if they're not, we're commenting on that. And then if rules continue to move forward and we think it's a problem, we'll challenge them in the courts. That's been a big piece of using the legal system to make sure that our laws are working as intended, that we're bringing the best science. And then we do work to ask scientific questions that we feel like aren't being addressed. So that's another, so again, working collaboratively with academics and community-based organizations to say, what are the questions that we actually want to ask? And really, a really important one is, how do we understand we know we're not just exposed to one of these chemicals at a time or one air pollutant at a time. It's the whole real world exposure. So we've been pushing the science in that space. How do we understand what the real world risks are, particularly to communities that are bearing heavy burdens of pollution and toxic exposure? So it's a real mix. That's why we have attorneys, we have scientists, we have advocates, and communication specialists all working together and then bringing many different people in to this conversation to what we say is to find the ways that work to make it so that we can breathe the air and we can drink our water and buy products without undermining our health.
Yeah, you bring up water, and I don't want to go off on too much of a side rail here, but I am in Iowa, and the Iowa's water quality right now is a serious public health and environmental issue. And it's driven mostly by like the nitrates and the phosphorus and the runoff from agricultural
Oh,
areas. And it is something where a lot of people are asking the questions like, what is going on? And when you don't get the answers, and you're like, well, we're still drinking this water, or like some people don't have access to test or buy the things to like have safe drinking water. It is nice to know that there may be people on the back end doing some heavy lifting to get those answers. And I think it's important that people who don't know, they're just frustrated, to know like, hey, there are people trying to do something to make sure that the water you're drinking and bathing in and feeding your children, giving your children is safe.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as you know, and you've said quite eloquently, like, when you lose the trust or confidence that the water you're drinking it's very disturbing. We've found even just in surveys that that's something that people um, really believe that there's a role for the government to play in making sure, like, it's a right. You feel like you should have a right to be able to drink clean water, and I think um, some of the work that we've done in the water space often brings together those water utilities who are responsible for delivering clean water, and they've got upstream issues, whether it's the nitrates from the runoff or it's PFAS chemicals, which are these we can get into later, these forever chemicals that are contaminating a
Mhm.
lot of drinking water. Um, you know, we've been working to how do you bring those folks all together to figure out, okay, what needs to be done? And it's really important that those who are impacted, people who are they need to be telling those stories, because that's the other thing that we rely on a lot, and we can also come back to this, is we really rely on working with everyday folks who are saying, this is a problem, this is coming up in my community, and I want my voice to be heard. That's what makes advocacy function in this country, is that it still remains to be a fairly democratic process.
Absolutely, absolutely. I thank you for acknowledging my little side my side rant.
Yeah,
Let's start.
it's a serious problem. We could have a
Yeah.
whole nother conversation on that one, because it is a
Yeah, that's a
big
part
problem.
2 and 3 maybe. That's
Okay.
that's a whole different conversation. Let's start from the ground up. The Toxic Substances Control Act. What is it, and why did it need reforming in the first place?
Yeah, so the Toxic Substances Control Act, we can call it TSCA, even though it sort of sounds like an Italian restaurant. But we call it TSCA. So we have to go back, do a little bit of history, which is that it was originally passed in 1976, signed into law by Gerald Ford, and that was at the tail end, really, of really a decade of political momentum, around within the environmental movement, the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency, the passage of the Clean Air Act, just really groundbreaking environmental statutes. And and it took that, it was long in the making, because we had had over a decade of just severe pollution, right? Cities choked with air pollution, rivers on fire, right? I mean, I think it's good, especially for younger listeners, to remember just how bad the visible pollution was at that time. As early as, and I had documented early, in the 50s, there were real public concerns about the proliferation of chemicals in their environment. Of course, pesticides being sprayed in neighborhoods. Actually, EDF got its start around helping to secure the ban on DDT. There were plastics coming into our kitchens and our grocery stores. There was this great quote in an article in the Washington Post in 1972, where the reporter wrote, "We're all little plastic now," and it was about a paper that had looked at chemicals used in plastics showing up in human blood. So it was in the zeitgeist, if you will, right? And so there's a mounting pressure to pass TSCA. And TSCA in some ways was this umbrella statute, in that some chemicals were dealt with in different environmental statutes, but there were a lot of gaps. Pesticides are dealt with separately. Chemicals that end up in your food or that you put on your body, like personal care products, they're regulated by a different statute, by FDA. But that left out tens of thousands of chemicals. So TSCA was passed to deal with those chemicals from across the whole life cycle, from production, use, all the way to disposal. So, but it was turned out to be a pretty ineffective statute, sadly enough. We, at the time, for many years, called it the dog that never barked. It was a dead letter law. It really, and there were a number of problems with it. And I won't go through everything, but some really important pieces of the problem was that it created, first of all, it grandfathered in tens of thousands of chemicals, just presumed safe with very little evidence.
Wow.
So that's a problem. And then it put the burden on EPA to demonstrate that a chemical was harmful, but it didn't provide them with any information. So it created this like catch-22. It had a very high burden of proof and no ability to actually to demonstrate that. The other, just two other kind of important pieces was that cost was integrated into what that safety standard for a chemical would be. And that made it also really hard for the agency to take action. And this became evident when EPA attempted to ban asbestos, which was well known to cause serious lung disease. And there had been many efforts to get it out of different uses. And so they proposed a ban, or they finalized a ban in 1989, and the Circuit Court of Appeals in the Fifth Circuit struck it down in 1991, and said that they had not basically determined that they had found what was called the least burdensome approach to managing asbestos risk. So again, the bar was just way too high, and this putting cost into determining the safety standard we saw as really inappropriate. And then for the hundreds of chemicals that come onto the market every year, there was like they weren't subject to really like any safety review. So you can think about how all these chemicals were coming onto the market. So it was very badly broken.
And in 10 years ago, Congress passed bipartisan reforms to this law, and that's rare. What made that moment possible, and what did those reforms actually change for everyday people?
Yeah, so the reforms were very long in the making. So, if you had this important court decision in 1991, by the late 90s, my organization, I wasn't there at the time, did an extensive review of the law, pointing out all its flaws, and then began to outline areas of what was needed in reform. And at the same time, you had a growing number of groups at the state level and community groups beginning to take action. Okay, if the federal government is not going to be able to deal with some of these chemicals, we're going to start introducing restrictions and bans at the state level. And California, like in many things, was a big leader in this, but so was the state of Washington and New York. There were many more states getting on board. California passed a pretty extensive Safe Products Act. The EU, European Union, passed a really comprehensive new chemical law in 2006 called REACH. That became a model for other countries. So the international landscape was changing. And then you had consumer product companies and retailers like Walmart, including the work that I just mentioned, that we really pushed them to urge them and work with them to create this policy that came out in 2013. A lot of companies were starting to set their own voluntary efforts to move high-risk chemicals out of the supply chain. So there was a lot of activity going on, if you will, in the market. And if you're a chemical producer and you suddenly have all these different state requirements, you've got a different requirement for the EU market, maybe the South Korean market, it's getting it's getting complicated. And so there were increasing interests for the chemical industry to come to the table on reforms. And that was notable because there had been bills to reform TSCA introduced as early as 2005. So in almost every year, for years and years and years, in part led by the late Senator Frank Lautenberg from New Jersey, whose father had been significantly impacted by the chemical industry, he was just driving this forward over and over, but it was always partisan. And not long before he died, he was able to cut a deal and really get the first bipartisan bill introduced. And then even after that, it was years and years of pushing and negotiating. But the law did pass with enormous bipartisan support. And it was signed into law by President Obama 10 years ago, just on June 22nd. But
Wow.
so today it took a long time. But it's important to recognize that, first, that major legislation takes a while to pass. But we're also really concerned about the speed at which some folks in Congress are trying to make pretty significant changes to it without that same amount of dialogue and engagement about what changes might be needed. To open up an entire statute is a really big deal.
Oh, so it took a long time to even get to where we're at, and now
Yeah.
they're trying to change things faster,
Yeah.
maybe not with a lot of thought, I guess,
Yeah.
into it, or a lot of pushback.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll say that the law in 2016 made, like with anything, when you take that long and you're trying to get a law passed out of any Congress, but it was hard enough then to do something bipartisan 10 years ago.
Mhm.
I mean, it's only gotten more partisan, but there were some significant improvements made to that law. So if you think about some of the points I made about how it was broken, the law in 2016, it mandated that EPA review what were called existing chemicals. So all those chemicals that were just presumed to be fine, now EPA had a mandate to review them and basically a pipeline to be reviewing these. And they had to determine that they don't pose an unreasonable risk to people and the environment. They can't consider cost in that evaluation. They consider cost when they're trying to determine. So if a chemical does present an unreasonable risk, then it goes on to another phase where, okay, how should we manage that risk? Then you can start to consider cost, but not when you're thinking about, is it safe? And the other important piece was that their EPA was told to take into account vulnerable individuals and communities when they determine that. That was really significant step as well. It also created a mandate for EPA to review those new chemicals that are coming onto the market all the time as well. And so those were significant shifts, and the law has been working. I mean, it's clunky and it's hard, but there have been restrictions of dangerous substances, asbestos, methylene chloride, trichloroethylene, which is a nasty solvent. And then there's been restrictions on new chemicals that people won't even hear about, that it's happening more quietly. And so I think that's the frustrating part about seeing a big push to try to undermine some of the improvements that were so hard fought 10 years ago.
Right, because you're seeing that it's saving lives, and to see
Yeah.
something kind of poke that and push that's saving lives, I'm sure that is frustrating.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, methylene chloride has killed people, a lot of people. So finally getting that ban was a really big deal. And trichloroethylene is a really nasty solvent, asbestos. And there's a whole suite of chemicals going
Right.
under review, dozens and dozens of them. And so, we've seen over the past couple of years under this current administration an effort through the EPA to really weaken the rules that are coming out in ways that we don't think follow this statute, so are unlawful and don't follow the science. And what we're seeing is that there's an effort to almost codify what's happening at EPA within the law, and that would have lasting damage far beyond this administration.
Right, man. And so, I want to touch on something you said earlier about like your work. Your work is really centered on communities, and what I would like to, kind of would love for you to go into is who is carrying kind of the heaviest burden when it comes to chemical exposure, and why is that?
Yeah. Well, so there is ample evidence, thanks in large part to decades and decades of work and leadership by the environmental justice community to document the disproportionate exposures and impacts of toxic emissions in Black and Brown communities. So you've got people of color nearly twice as likely to live near an industrial site. More than half of people living within a couple miles of toxic waste sites are people of color. So you have the proliferation of industrial sites proposed and built near communities. Some of these same communities are often facing higher exposure to air pollution, so they may be close to other polluting facilities, highways, elevated highways, and that's not just like a random, occurrence.
Mm,
That, and once again, this has all been very well documented. That is the impact in large part from redlining. So, redlining, of course, refers to this systematic denial of services like mortgages, insurance, loans to residents in certain areas because of their racial or ethnic makeup of the neighborhoods. Had nothing to do with financial risk, right? And the term comes from the federal government, actually created color-coded maps to assess neighborhood investment risk. And so that depreciated those property values. And with cheap land come landfills, industrial sites, right?
mhm.
Highway construction, on top of, repressed access to political power to fight that. So you have decades of that. I think probably many people will have heard of the 80-mile stretch of land between New Orleans and Baton Rouge in Louisiana, that's home to more than 150 petrochemical facilities and refineries just back to back within historic Black communities. And the cancer risks in these communities are the highest in the country.
Yeah.
And it has been given, the name of Cancer Alley, and
Yep.
just incredibly high cancer rates. And then, you have smaller rural and small communities across the country that are living near rail lines. I think, the derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, where you had vinyl chloride emitted, it heavily contaminated that community. And then you've got communities all over the country that have reported high levels of PFAS in their drinking water, other hazardous substances in the air. So then you have it concentrated in some communities, but then you actually have dense distribution as well, and particularly in communities where it's cheaper to put these facilities. The other kind of community of folks that we're concerned about in terms of impact are workers, right? And so workers may be using, solvents, heavy duty cleaning
Mm,
materials, right? Paints, glues, adhesives. And some of those same workers then may be going back and living in communities that are also highly polluted, right? So you're seeing that,
right. Just constantly
cumulative
just
impact, right? So, or you're working in a nail salon, and and then the other kind of group of people that we're also concerned about in their terms of their vulnerabilities are children's, infants, and pregnant women. And so, in general, because you're more vulnerable when you're small and you're developing, and then obviously if you're a infant or a pregnant woman, then also living in an area with more high levels of pollution, you're going to be in higher risk. So, it comes around to this fact of this isn't just you're exposed to one chemical and how do we assess the risk, which, by the way, is a sort of an outdated way of how we do it. But when you start thinking about how are people really exposed and who's more
Mhm.
heavily impacted, and how do we then ensure that those folks are protected when we're issuing a rule. And we really believe that TSCA mandated EPA to do that. And there is a big effort to really undermine that approach right now.
Yeah, man, it's just sad because you think about the those under resourced or underserved communities that they know the problems, but they don't have the resources for a solution. So it's almost like, what am I supposed to do?
Yeah.
And that's why I was excited for you to be on the show, to let people know there are things that are happening, and there are ways that you can have your voice be heard. And I'll make sure that I have some of those things in the links of this episode. But like it is a man, Sarah, it's a weird time. Like, it's just a weird
I
time for some of
know.
these things going on. It's hard to put it all into words. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, right
I know.
right now. Sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, no, no. It is a weird time, and I don't know if I just wanted to say that it can feel really overwhelming. And we know this, like when we talk about chemicals and people go like, oh my God. So like everything around me is killing me. Like I can't do, I can't do anything
Mhm.
about, like I've got other things to worry about. And I think the message that we try to send is what I started with earlier. One is, no, you shouldn't have to, right? This is the role for an independent government doing its job, using science in the best way to protect you. And guess what? By the way, when we survey most Americans, like this is a shared value. It is not
Right.
partisan. People really want the government to be doing that, and they don't want to see big vested interests, corporate interests kind of running the show, which is what we have right now in a really big way. And I think then the other one point to make is that there are things you can do. There are things that you can do that are no to low cost. They're not going to be frictionless in this frictionless world, but where you can take some steps to protect you and your family, and you can make your voice heard. So I don't know if it's worth just highlighting a few of those, because we really do believe that
Yeah.
it shouldn't be a privilege to buy green, and I think that now there are a lot of things that you can do. I mean, for starters, oh, did I lose you, Corey?
Nope, you're still here.
Okay, good. Just making sure.
Mhm.
Um, there are a couple simple things. Coming down to some of the basics. Checking your house for lead. You can go to the hardware store, and there are these very cheap strips, and you can just test the dust, especially around areas where you're coming in and out of the house. We've known lead's a problem for a very long time. You can check with your local water utility and find out if they have a program to get lead pipes. There's a lot of money that's come out of the federal government to get lead pipes that deliver drinking water to your home out of the ground. You can choose no fragrant products. So fragranted products often contain a set of compounds called phthalates. These are well known to impact the reproductive system. Here, it's not really necessary. I know some families get really attached to a certain smell and it has an emotional value, but I know I know you can break it if you understand that you're bringing in really an unnecessary risk, particularly for children, young children.
Mhm.
And that goes, for your laundry and things like that. Don't microwave with plastic. Try to keep plastic toys out of your children's chewing, mouths. You can avoid things like stain-resistant clothing and fabric. And probably the simplest one as a public health advocate is, when in doubt, wash your hands. So chemicals in the products that we use in our homes, they accumulate in the dust. And so, washing your hands after you've been cleaning, particularly when you're cleaning out the lint in your dryer, we know that, for example, what are called flame retardants have been found to accumulate in that lint. Just wash your hands. Keep your kids away from that. Those are just sort of simple things that have been shown to be able to actually lower your exposure to some of these chemicals that we're concerned about. And then just lastly, there are clean products out there that are totally cost comparative. There's a program that the EPA has had and is still doing called Safer Choice, where they've actually looked at the products it's for cleaning products. And retailers like, all the main retailers have programs now where they are looking at high risk chemicals in their supply chains. And some of them will have sort of, clean shops, part of their shops. Walmart has one, Target, many of the big retailers. And those, are the products getting better and they're being more cost comparative. So there are some, there's some few things that I gave you a long list, but there are things that you can do to measurably lower your exposure.
No, that's amazing. It's always good to know there are some things that are within your power that you can control and that can have some really good benefits. Right now, Congress is looking at possible changes to TSCA, and advocates are raising alarms. Walk us through what's actually being proposed and what would it mean if those protections get weakened?
Yeah. So there's been a lot of activity here. I'm here in Washington. There are no formal bills yet introduced. So I'm not going to give you like a name of a bill and that's spy, but there are a lot of what are kind of called draft proposals. That means there's actual text circulating around. And so I'm going to just touch on some themes of problems that we see. And it's a little deja vu if we go back to, broken TSCA. First, that one is this setting a really impossible to meet standard for EPA to take action, just raising that standard really high. And we think would just undermine EPA's ability to take action on well-known hazardous chemicals that they're reviewing now, like cancer-causing formaldehyde and vinyl chloride. It takes away, there are proposals that strip out that requirement to consider the people who are most at risk. And so then what you end up doing is just dangerously underestimating the health risks of where those chemicals may be produced, or worker exposures. So that's a real concern. Efforts to make it a lot easier for potentially new chemicals to come onto the market with little or no review, just kind of rubber stamping them again, a bit of going back to the way things were. Some proposals have created just unbelievable conflicts of interest, inviting industry to play a real outsized role in reviewing its own chemicals, and then creating some loopholes for kind of classes of chemicals that we know are quite hazardous. So it has, from large part, what we've seen does make us really concerned, and I think not for crazy reasons, because we saw for decades a law that wasn't working.
Right.
And now, and then seeing some of those important changes just dramatically watered down or really even worsened is incredibly frustrating, particularly given, as I mentioned earlier, that most all Americans favor the law when they hear about it, right? They think that it should be doing more. And so this is really the interests of, a few powerful interests, trying to get essentially what they would like versus what's in the best interests of the public and the public's health.
Yeah, I want to touch on that very small group of people that want this because um, there's a tension that they would say that this regulation hurts businesses and innovation, and there may be some lawmakers that maybe agree with that or go with that for whatever their reasons are, whether I think they're stupid or not.
Mhm.
Um, how do you respond to that argument?
Yeah. So this argument that regulation kills innovation and kills market forces is just wrong. I mean, it's factually wrong, and I'll kind of point out a couple of key points about that. There's also a long history of the chemical industry saying the sky is going to fall if some small action is taken, or a market would collapse, and we wouldn't be able to grow food if a certain pesticide had some restrictions, and that's never been the case. And it's a compelling argument, right? And it makes, because no one wants to hamper innovation, but it's not considering a couple of really important factors. First, there's a real reality that there's an important relationship to having strong, consistent rules of the road, if you will, effective regulations that actually incentivizes smarter innovation. It actually can be a driver of innovation. And we've seen that with the Clean Air Act, for example. Companies that are buying chemicals to make products that you and I buy, they don't want the risk of the chemical, right? They just want their product to work. So, and they don't want the liability that comes with that, which has been a big issue with lots of chemicals, lead and these PFAS compounds that are showing up everywhere. And there's a well-documented history that some in the chemical industry have deliberately hid or distorted evidence of harm of chemicals for decades. So there's an agreement among many inside the private sector, broadly defined, not just the producers of chemicals, that actually want independent, rigorous, robust evidence to be kind of setting the rules of the road, right? Because you don't want that risk on your books, right? So for the best interests of sort of like collective society, having these rules that are driving innovation, giving people the flexibility to get there on their own, but you need a standard. Otherwise, it's just mayhem, right? It's just
Mm,
chaos. And so like innovation at innovation so that we can have a bunch more persistent toxic chemicals that the drinking water utilities have to clean up. That's what we've had with PFAS, for example. Just getting approved onto the market, and guess who's farmers now have liability, and consumer product
mm,
companies and drinking water companies. That's not good innovation, right? There's innovation, and then there's like innovation that's
right.
going to lift people and health. And then the second really important factor is that um, you have to consider there are real benefits when we innovate more safely, because there are real health impacts to putting toxic chemicals out into the world. Again, lead is just this long historic case where the EPA issued a rule not long ago designed to really pull these lead pipes out of our drinking water system. And they estimated, and they looked at all the different health impacts of lead. And they estimated that the investment made to pull those lead pipes out was going to be a ratio of 35 to 1. And it would bring anywhere from like 17 to $34 billion annually in
Wow.
healthcare benefits. So the part we have to think about when we're thinking about innovation is when you do it badly, you're putting enormous cost onto society. It's just not the cost that's sitting on, the chemical producers' books. It's on
Right.
everybody else's. And so, yes, we want innovation, but we want it done in a way that's going to, bring real benefit over long periods of time. It's not going to, push the risk onto society or onto, individuals or other companies, right? You have to consider the whole the whole factor of what does it mean to have innovation and protect our public's health, which is what TSCA is meant to do. It's meant to do both.
That's amazing, Sarah. Thank you so much. I'm going to let you drop the mic right there. That was great, Sarah. For those that are listening that want to learn more about the Environmental Defense Fund, how they can be better advocates for this work, where can they find you, and how can they connect with the work?
Yeah. Yes, get your voice known and heard. You can learn a lot about TSCA that we were talking about today at edf.org//TSCA. We also have a map that of the United States where you can look to see where you live and and your proximity to manufacturing of chemicals regulated under this law. And that you can just put in chemicalactionmap.edf.org, and you put in your zip code and scroll in, and there's a area where you can take action and let your representatives know that you want them to take action on toxic chemicals.
Awesome. Again, Sarah, thank you so much for being on the show with me today. I would love to have you back for a part 2 about water at some point, because that is a huge thing for us here in the state of Iowa. And there are a lot of people in communities that have no idea what's going on. They just know the water is bad, but they don't know why.
Mm-hmm.
So that is something that we're currently working with. But again, thank you so much for being with me today. And everybody, thank you for listening to the Healthy Project podcast. Everything that Sarah talked about today, I will make sure I have those links in the description of this episode to make it easy for you to get to, so you don't have to try to figure it out through just trying to rewind and listen. Make it a lot easier for you. Again, thank you so much for joining us on the Healthy Project podcast. I'll holler at you next time.